Well, the same way we broke the gridlock with the Martin Luther King bill that I introduced, when people would say, I'll join your bill, John, but I know you can't get it passed, but I'm going to join it anyway. Now, in the case of Dr. King, I didn't have to make an argument for his greatness, his contribution, his brilliance, his courage, his contribution to the nation and to the world and to his people. Now here in reparations, it's a little further back. It's one step removed at least. And so here the case has to be made. And it is true, you're right. This has to go through Congress because it's going to be legislation that will have some appropriation, some a budget requirement attached to it. And therefore, we have to treat it like we did civil rights legislation, the right to vote, and everything else that ultimately becomes law. If there was some way to get around it, I'd be the first to do it.
Congressman Conyers had long been considered one of the progressive members of the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congressional Black Caucus overwhelmingly were progressive in comparison to the United States House of Representatives. So him being considered a radical within a group that would have been considered radical in the first place made this a perfect fit. So he would be one of those congressmen who would listen to an idea about the discussion of reparations. Many Congress people would not have even entertained a discussion about some thought of demanding reparations, or even demanding the discussion of reparations by the federal government.
My dad gave John Conyers his first fundraiser was in my home in Russell Woods on Glendale Street. My dad had a fundraiser for John Conyers when he first ran for Congress. So, of course, we know that John Conyers eventually won, and their relationship blossomed.
John Conyers was a seminal individual in this movement toward reparations. John Conyers is a Detroiter. He gets elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1964, start to serve in 1965. But what's important to this question is, in 1989 and successive two-year sessions after that, John Conyers routinely introduces legislation in the U.S. House of Representatives on Capitol Hill that address the reparations question. Whether or not we should have a study group, whether or not that should be a process that's carried out. There's no question that John Conyers is an important figure in this movement.
Reparations are mentioned from Kosovo to Israel to Alaska. It's a common diplomatic strategy that has been used from time immemorial in our history. Now, it may require a little more unique application of the theory if there is a debt, if there is a seeking of an apology, if there is an offering of an apology, if there is a desire for atonement, then we may create out of this a different kind of reparations, because there have been discussions now held, and I'm so proud that these discussions are now coming forward without any prompting out of universities, out of think tanks, out of writers and creative people just being drawn to the subject matter. And what's happening now is that we now have a literature on African reparations for enslavement in America, how it would happen, and why it would happen, and who it would happen to. And this takes me out of the difficult initial task of writing a reparations bill that people could say, well, I support this, or I want this one, or I want that one. We're so beginning in our dialogue, so new in this discussion, that I don't want to give you the Conyers solution to reparations for America. What I do want to give you is the opportunity for us to have an official study and discussion of this for the first time in our history. And if we do that with carefully appointed members of a commission who would not only do their own work, but would conduct hearings around the country for all Americans, so that this is not just an intelligentsia resolution of the problem, but the people with all views would be heard, then we would have the first official body of literature on this in the United States history.
Part of the, what was integral to the civil rights movement was integral to his work is coalition building, right? We don't talk about it enough. I think a lot of times today we're hyper fixated on individualism and how much I can do and make things happen and how much I can inspire. But part of the work is making it so the work can do what it needs to do when you're not in the room, right? When people are away from you. And so my father was really, really big on coalition building, bringing people from various parts of the country, various walks of life together to the table around one idea and getting input so that we can make this the broadest and best to reach the most people and impact the most people.
We got together and I was tasked with interviewing some of the greatest minds in the country, such as Queen Mother Audley Moore, who was in her 80s, late 80s, early 90s at that point in time, along with Mrs. Rosa Parks, who worked for Congressman Conyers in the Detroit office. I worked in the Washington office, and also Raymond Jenkins, who became Reparations Ray, along with Professor Charles Ogletree, economists such as Dr. Julianne Malveaux, Bob Johnson, who was the founder of BET Networks. We had corporate minds, we had academicians, we had civil rights activists, Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, as well as Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the widow of Dr. Martin Luther King, Dr. Betty Shabazz, who's a native Detroiter, the widow of Malcolm X, who had talked about reparations. And so from that, I, along with the staff, we synthesized information and started developing the reparations bill or language. So the first bill that we introduced in November 20th to be exact, 1989, was H.R. 3745. And I remember so vividly, I'm going to take you to November 11th of 1989. Congressman Conyers was so serious, he wanted it to be introduced before the end of that congressional session.
Both Betty Shabazz and Rosa Parks.
Two very important figures who happen to be women. And as we recognize sometimes, as we recognize as Black men, that we always haven't been as inclusionary with Black women, consider that Betty Shabazz and Rosa Parks were members of this community, strong members of this community, and contributors to this community. Again, that just goes to the whole point of just how important, and I'm biased, how important this town is in terms of leadership for the country.
Well, you have to think about 35 years ago when we initially drafted that legislation and the temperature in the country at that time. There are a lot of people who said it didn't go far enough. And so the minds that came together in the drafting was to put together a commission to study how reparations could be dispersed to descendants of enslaved people here in the United States. So again, we're talking 35 years ago, and it still has principally the same language that Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee has continued to introduce the legislation after Congressman Conyers retired, because she's on the House Judiciary Committee.
An executive order would be very helpful, and we've gotten pretty close to that. I mean, I was in the White House when the president signed the order for the Tuskegee, the ignoble Tuskegee experiment, and which he brought all of those. There were some survivors in the family, and there wasn't a dry eye in the White House.
And I think in the beginning people just thought maybe he was foolish or something, but after a while and they saw the in-depth research that he's done, you know, he made sure that he had the brightest, the best of the brightest, from young people to middle-aged people to older people working on his staff, so that all the things that he thought about, or even just said, I'm thinking about this, he can tell the light, go over there and find me some information about this. And they would always bring back exactly what he wanted and what he was thinking, and then he would tweak it to where he thought it would be representative of his people, because he was for his people.
I think the number one thing and the biggest takeaway from his life, legacy, and work is the importance of doing work and investing in work that you may not be around to see come to fruition. There's two major things right now, maybe three. As we look at AI, right, I think about my father's legislation with Humphrey Hawkins' full employment. As you know, AI automation comes and decreases the amount of jobs that humans can actually do. I look at reparations, and you know, we're still a ways out, I'm sure, but having people and planting that season for people to go do that work. And then Medicare for all, right? Medicare for all is vital. We are one of the sickest nations in the world while also being the wealthiest. And those two things, in theory, shouldn't go together, but they do. And so, again, planting that seed, having someone like a Bernie Sanders, a presidential candidate, take that to a larger platform, and with my father's blessing, I think that's a takeaway, right? Be invested in the work, not invested in the outcome, and good things will happen.
Every year he was excited about introducing H.R. 40 in the House of Representatives, because he says every year more and more people start getting involved and wanting to sign on to the bill. I think in the beginning people thought it was a joke. It's kind of like everybody deserves something except for African Americans, blacks. And we were the most enslaved people. I know that some people believe that they endured more than what we've endured. And he didn't necessarily believe that. He thought that we were still encountering injustices, and he just felt that there should be a commission to study the injustices that have happened to African Americans, and where we should go from there, and what we should get